and thank you for attending the opening of Soldiery British Army Portraits. Please allow me to introduce myself. Ian did most of the work, but I would just like to introduce what I used to do. And I'm a fine art portrait photographer. For 14 years, I've photographed many of the world's most recognised faces, from Sir Patrick Stewart to Ian McKellen, William Shatner, who played Captain Kirk, and you can see a pattern here. Yes, I do like science fiction in a big way. Basically, before I begin, I'd like to thank my wife, Alexandra, for all their support. I would also like to thank my parents, and without their guidance, I wouldn't be here. I'd also like to thank General Sir James Everard for all his help with the project, and finally thank the 278 incredible British Army soldiers who sat for the project, and some of them are sat here today. Now, in 2015, I was engrossed in another project, as Ian mentioned, entitled Northerners. My aim was to capture a wide variety of cities from the north of England, so politicians, celebrities, etc. One of those military figures, who was actually a Northerner himself, was General Horton. General Sir Nicholas Horton was Chief of the Defence Staff at the time, and I wrote a letter inviting the General to sit for a portrait, and he accepted. The image of Horton, what I wanted to evoke, it was my first military sitting, was that of the soldier's soldier. So you see Horton with no finery, no medals, no dress uniform, just simple simplicity of the soldier and the experience. I use a lot of harsh lighting, as you've probably seen. The harshness, every scar, every mark, everything is maintained, and this is quite important to my work. As a historian and a history graduate, I was absolutely tickled by the fact that Britain's top soldier was represented by my picture. So, it's something that I was fascinated with. And after the sitting, I was thinking to myself, I'd love to do more. I wrote a series of letters, and one fortuitously landed on the desk of General Sir James Everard, who at the time held the post of Commander Field Army. During the sitting, I mentioned my interest in expanding this project, and the General very kindly helped to set up some sittings with just 5 regiments. We started off very small. One would say the most iconic. I would say the Royal Lancers first, because the General is sitting here, and there are a few Lancers in the room. Then the Grenadier Guards, the Gurkhas, the Rifles, and the Household Cavalry. I know Colonel Casely is in the room somewhere as well, so it's the back. But literally, so we began small. And, however, the project just seemed to grow, and grow, and grow, and grow, and literally it went on, and on, and on, and these are all the regimental badges of every regiment and battalion and corps that sat for the project. 24 in all, 278 soldiers. The project in itself took 2 years to photograph. During this 2-year period, as I say, 278 soldiers sat. It is impossible, in my opinion, to look at these portraits, and as a historian, I say this without realising you are viewing living history. The British Army and its regiments date back to 1651. Some people may correct me with that date. The work, in essence, became what I wanted it to become, a record of the British Army in the 21st century. Diverse, modern, traditional, and with a great pride in the regiment, and indeed a good loyalty to the Crown. I also was pleased that this work has been acquired, or some of the work has been acquired by the National Portrait Gallery in London, and it's on display here in its rightful place, in my opinion, at the National Army Museum. I've been privileged to combine my passion for history and military in the application of photographing these individuals, and I really did underestimate how diverse the British Army is. The Army not only draws recruits from the UK, but from across the Commonwealth, and it has a real rich diversity. It's one of the most inclusive organisations I've ever worked with, and I've been a photographer for 14 years, worked with many corporate organisations and government organisations. And I was pleased to work with soldiers from many diversities, sexualities and backgrounds. I wouldn't say this project is a history of the British Army. In the words of the historian Sir John Fortescue, the civilian who attempts to write military history is guilty of an act of presumption, which I agree with. I've never served in the army. Unfortunately, it skipped a generation with myself, but I do have a love of the soldier. Indeed, this project is a document, and each image seems to evoke a story and depicts a different tale. Inspiration for Colonel Porter's portrait actually came from probably an engagement. The regiment was probably engaged in the American Revolutionary War, I'm not too sure. You'll have to correct me on the history. But the portrait of Washington crossing the Delaware by Emanuel Lutzer was my inspiration. Porter is my George Washington. His guidon chap is carrying the Star Spangled Banner, and this is where I got my inspiration for the portrait. If you see the portrait in its full spectrum, you'll see more of that. So this is where I get my ideas from. Now, of particular value when it came to composing elements of soldiery, I looked at Sir Thomas Lawrence. Now, Sir Thomas Lawrence was described as the English Titian. So, in essence, Sir Thomas Lawrence was one of those great artists. After the defeat of Napoleon in 1814, he got a wonderful commission to photograph all those political and military figures who helped to defeat Napoleon. And all these are on display in Windsor Castle in the Waterloo Chamber. I do recommend you go and have a look. It's an amazing space, and you'll see all these portraits. And again, the way in which Sir Thomas Lawrence portrays his characters is another influence in the project. So when you look at some of the positions and postures, Sir Thomas Lawrence gave me some real inspiration. But believe me, there is a touch of me in there as well. But as General Everard described, there is this instant eagerness in the eyes of the younger soldier, and then there is this reserved, circumspect and measured look for the soldier who's seen action, who's seen combat, and soldiery really reflects this in its depictions of British military figures. Now, I had the opportunity to work with many combat veterans. One of the most interesting sittings took place in Liverpool with an army reservist who got in touch with me when he heard about the project, and I was very glad to actually meet him and photograph him. Now, this chap is Major John Melville, who served in the British Army for over 30 years. He'd probably kill me if I said that if he was here today. But looking at the uniform, it's possible just to read Melville's military career. He served in the army since 1970, around that period, in Northern Ireland. Then he joined the commandos and fought in the Battle of Goose Green, the Falkland Islands. Then he went off to Bosnia. Then he did Iraq twice and Afghanistan twice in the modern, re-enlisting continuously as he went along. And he's just an incredible soldier, full of stories. But again, you see this reserved, circumspect look. What I like to do with sitters, if I have that time, is talk about their military career, try and bring things to the surface in order to capture this circumspect expression. Now, I was very pleased to work with the diverse spectrum of the British Army, and I want to thank the Army Lesbian and Gay, Bisexual and Transgender Forum, who really helped me with the sittings and helped me to connect with serving soldiers from the LGBT. Deborah Penny, I know, is here, is an amazing presence. We had such fun in the sitting as well. I actually enjoyed your sitting. It was one of my favourites, to be honest. We did have a real laugh. Now, soldiers do take a pride in the regiment, and as General Everard said, I wanted to capture this pride, this collective, unique tradition. So across the sittings, I asked soldiers to pose collectively and capture all these different aspects of the uniform. In this depiction of the Royal Lancers, with the Captains Humphreys, Pritchard, White, and Annie Isaac, Julian, you're wearing a different crossbelt, is that right? So again, this is something I like to highlight. This crossbelt was before the amalgamation, so again, it tells the history of the regiment and the portrait. Just a few more of the sittings I want to mention. I mean, I had the opportunity to work with the Household Division and Major General Bathurst, and many of you may not know that is Wellington's desk that he was sitting behind, and it was an extraordinary sitting. The desk is literally 300 years old, been sitting in their office, and it was Wellington actually sat behind it when he commanded the British Army. Another challenge was to photograph the parachute regiment. They're one of the most interesting combat units to photograph. They're always wired and ready to go. Some of these guys are on 3-hour standby, so if there's a crisis, they have to go to it straight away. So it was interesting to capture all their modern equipment, and soldiery did encompass that in full MTP, carrying everything ready for action. I mean, this paratrooper, for instance, has everything he would wear to go into battle. So jumping out of a plane, and there he is on the field. And actually held this mortar. It's very light. so you'd be quite surprised, it's not that heavy. Next, I'd like to mention one of my favourite sittings, which took place with the 2nd Battalion of the Royal Gurkha Rifles. I had the chance to look at the crockery up close, forgive me. It's a formidable weapon, and it's even been used in Afghanistan, apparently, people have told me. And as I say, just one more quote I'm going to give you. Was a former Army Chief of Staff, Field Marshal Sam Mackenshaw, once stated, "If a man says he's not afraid of dying, he's either lying or he is a Gurkha." And in fact, their motto is "better to die than be a coward." And the faces of each rifleman are remarkable. It was a truly amazing afternoon to work with the battalion. Every shot was a project in itself, in my opinion. Now, the other thing I was interested in, Cap, was the pageantry, and visiting the Household Cavalry was such a privilege. I went, behind the scenes of the guard mount, saw the soldiers going out, got a real sense and feel of the regiment, and we captured quite a cross-section from the Blues and Royals, from the lifeguards, and it was interesting just to capture the musicians, the trumpeters, everything. These uniforms are so beautiful and intricate, it must take a long time to create them. And just capturing the gold and the colour really stands out in the project. If you do have a look at the book, these pictures will appear in there. Now, what's the future of what's next, you may ask? Well, I'm interested in expanding the project. So, while Soldiery was happening, I read the papers and looked at the press and what was happening, and was any foreign military people visiting or anything going on. And I found out that Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry was visiting England last year, and they took up public duties at Buckingham Palace. So I got in touch, and the regiment actually agreed to sit for me. So it was an extraordinary opportunity to take Soldiery to Canada. I took risks almost in creating this work. We encountered minefields on the way, and we negotiated our way through, as General Everard will no doubt tell you. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce General Sir James Emerald, a copy of the 4 lances, but it encompasses the regiment and the uniform.
That's really fun.
Enjoy it.
So much.
But thank you,
Yeah,
General.